Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. The stellar compound was a sprawling prison facility that sat orbiting a desolate moon, nestled deep within the uncharted nebula. It was a place where the worst of the galaxy's criminal scum were housed, spanning multiple species, all with their own histories of violent deeds, treachery, and lawlessness. Within its reinforced walls, the hierarchy of power wasn't decided by rank or status, but by strength and ruthlessness. The alien species that made up the majority of the prisoners were tall, muscular creatures like the HFY, a massive, reptilian species with thick, armored hides and jaws strong enough to snap bone. Then there were the Harlans, an insectoid race known for their viciously sharp mandibles and ability to regenerate limbs after being injured. There were also the Zarthar, a race of telepathic beings who had the ability to manipulate thoughts and emotions to control their victims. However, despite their immense physical or mental abilities, the most terrifying force in the prison was something the aliens had long underestimated: the human prisoner, known as David Gray. David had been thrown into this galactic hellscape after a series of tragic misunderstandings. A human ambassador, falsely accused of espionage and sabotage, had been shipped across the stars to this brutal prison to rot. From the moment he arrived, he was treated as nothing more than an insect to be crushed beneath the heels of these alien species. But little did they know, David was no ordinary human. In fact, they would soon come to regret their decision to pick on him. The prison's central courtyard buzzed with activity, the cacophony of different alien dialects and guttural sounds creating a disturbing chorus. The guards, a mix of silent, tall, faceless beings of unknown origin, watched from their high platforms, their weapons always aimed at the prisoners below. It was in this very courtyard that David found himself, his solitary cell standing near the arena where prisoners were often forced to fight for sport. As he stepped onto the dirt-covered ground, David could feel the eyes of the entire prison on him. His appearance was far from impressive. He was an average-sized human in his late 20s, with unruly brown hair and a face that barely spoke of the hardships he had endured. The guards had stripped him of all belongings upon his arrival: his communicator, his clothes, his pride, leaving him with nothing but his bare skin. Yet, beneath the seemingly helpless exterior was something that none of the aliens could comprehend: a deep, unwavering resolve to survive. A group of HFY prisoners, led by a towering brute named Zark, had taken a keen interest in David from the moment he stepped foot in the courtyard. The HFY had a reputation for bullying the weaker prisoners, and human beings were at the top of their list. They sneered at David, their reptilian eyes narrowing as they circled him like vultures around a carcass. Zark, the leader of the HFY, took the first swing. His clawed fist came barreling down, aiming to smash David's face into the dirt. But David, although physically weaker, wasn't as defenseless as they thought. With a speed that caught Zark off guard, he dodged the blow and ducked beneath the giant's reach. Zark roared in frustration, his large tail swishing through the air like a whip. The other HFY prisoners laughed, egging on their leader as they observed the human's futile attempts to escape. "What's the human doing? Trying to run away? He's not going anywhere," one of the HFY jeered, his voice a harsh, guttural growl. Another HFY barked, "Let me teach him the true meaning of pain." But David didn't run. No, he wasn't here to escape, at least not yet. His mind raced with strategies, calculating the movements of his attackers. It was true that the HFY were stronger and faster, but David had something they didn't: ingenuity. And he wasn't afraid to use it. Zark lunged again, this time bringing both of his massive arms down with a fury that would have flattened most prisoners. But David sidestepped with uncanny precision, using the momentum to shift Zark's weight off balance. The HFY stumbled, unable to adjust in time. Before Zark could recover, David landed a precise, targeted blow to the underside of his jaw, an area Zark hadn't protected with his armor. The strike sent Zark sprawling backward, crashing into the ground with a deafening thud. For a moment there was silence. The other HFY stared in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Their leader, an unstoppable force, had been knocked down by this human. The once proud bully, Zark, was writhing on the ground, groaning in disbelief. David stood still, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His eyes flickered toward the remaining THRYSS, watching for any sign of movement. "I don't care what you think of me," David said in a low, calm voice. "But if you touch me again, you'll regret it." The rest of the THRYSS were stunned. No human had ever dared to speak like that before, let alone challenge their strength. Slowly, one of the THRYSS muttered in their guttural language, "He's not like the others." Zark struggled to get back to his feet, his eyes blazing with fury. "This human will die. I swear it." But the other prisoners had already begun to take notice. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the prisoners who had once looked at David with disdain and pity now looked on with a mix of awe and respect. The reputation of the THRYSS had just been shattered, and it wasn't by brute force. It was by a human who had outsmarted them. The THRYSS would regret this moment, and soon, all the prisoners in the compound would learn that David Gray wasn't the weak, defenseless human they thought he was. He was something far more dangerous. David's challenge to the THRYSS wasn't just a small victory. It was a seismic shift in the dynamics of the stellar compound. The prison, which had been a brutal and lawless place, was suddenly buzzing with a new energy. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispered among the prisoners in every corner of the compound. "Did you see what the human did?" one of the Zarthar asked another, their telepathic voices tinged with disbelief. "He took down Zark," the second Zarthar replied, their minds still processing the sight. "Zark is supposed to be invincible." In the cafeteria, a group of Harlans, the insectoid criminals known for their viciousness, chattered among themselves. "The human is dangerous," one muttered, clicking his mandibles together nervously. "Perhaps we should stay away." David was becoming an enigma, a mystery that couldn't be solved by brute force alone. It was clear now that he wasn't just another hapless human. But what did this mean for the rest of the prisoners? And how would the THRYSS react to their humiliating defeat? As Zark struggled to rise to his feet, David watched him carefully, measuring his opponent. The THRYSS leader was enraged, his pride shattered, and that kind of fury was dangerous. But David wasn't afraid. He had faced worse threats in his life, the kind of threats that had shaped him into someone who had learned to survive in the harshest of conditions. Zark finally regained his footing, his eyes glowing with a menacing light. His tail swished violently, and his claws scraped against the ground in agitation. "You think you can defeat me, human?" he snarled. "I am Zark, the mightiest of the THRYSS. I'll make you regret this." David's posture remained relaxed, his breathing steady. He spoke again, this time louder so the others could hear. "You didn't learn your lesson the first time, did you? If you think you can intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Zark's eyes narrowed. He lunged forward, this time with both fists raised. But David was ready. He sidestepped again, the speed of his movement surprising even himself. Before Zark could even attempt to recover from his missed strike, David was already on the move. His foot swept out, sending Zark crashing to the ground once more, this time with a sharp, painful grunt. A chorus of gasps rose from the crowd of watching prisoners. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A human, a mere human, was dismantling the leader of the most feared species in the prison with ease. The once dominant THRYSS were being humbled in front of their peers. "Enough!" Zark roared, shaking his head and rising again. His voice was filled with pure fury, but something had changed in him. He was no longer the indomitable creature he had been before. His arrogance had been shattered, and now he was fueled only by vengeance. He charged at David, this time with an unpredictability that suggested desperation. David remained calm as the THRYSS' enormous fist swung toward him. With quick reflexes, David dodged again, but this time, he did more than just avoid the strike. He reached out with precision and grabbed Zark's wrist, twisting it in a sharp, painful angle that forced the massive creature to stumble forward. As Zark fell off balance, David swiftly slammed his knee into the THRYSS abdomen, causing the air to whoosh out of his lungs. Zark gasped for breath, unable to fully recover as David pressed his advantage. David stood over him, looking down with a cold gaze that silenced the remaining taunts from the watching prisoners. "You should have listened the first time," David said. "I warned you. Stay down, and I'll make sure you leave me alone. Keep this up, and it won't end well for you." For a moment, Zark hesitated. The THRYSS had never known defeat like this. They had been the unstoppable force, the ones who took what they wanted with brute strength, and now they were facing something they couldn't grasp. A human, who should have been weak and fragile, had humiliated them in front of everyone. Zark's pride and his warrior's confidence had been shattered beyond repair. The watching prisoners stood in stunned silence, the magnitude of what had just transpired settling in. And then, slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The Zarthar whispered to one another, their telepathic minds buzzing with intrigue. The Harlans seemed more cautious, no longer openly mocking David's humanity. Even the Silens, who had always been the neutral overseers of the prison, seemed to take notice, their cold, expressionless faces reflecting no emotion but the awareness of the shift in the balance of power. Zark, once the unquestioned king of the prison, finally spoke in a low, guttural voice. "I yield." He spat out the words, his pride bleeding through the submission. The crowd's response was immediate, a low murmur that quickly transformed into a ripple of admiration. The once invincible THRYSS leader had just been forced to submit by a single human. The consequences of this moment would echo through the prison for weeks to come. But for David, it wasn't over. He had more to prove, both to his fellow prisoners and to himself. As David turned to walk away, his eyes scanning the crowd, he could feel the shift. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was someone who could be feared, someone who could command respect. The THRYSS had underestimated him, and they would never make that mistake again. The lesson had been learned, not only by the THRYSS, but by every other being in the prison. The human was no longer the weak, insignificant species they had once laughed at. And from this moment forward, David Gray would not be pushed around. In this prison, it was the strong who survived, and David had just proven he was stronger than anyone had thought. But the question remained. Would this newfound respect be enough to protect him from the dangers yet to come? The prison wasn't just made up of THRYSS, after all, and some of the other prisoners, seeing the humans rise, might decide to test just how much he could take. David spent the following days walking a delicate line between respect and animosity. The shift in the prison's dynamics after his confrontation with Zark was palpable, and while most of the prisoners seemed to have backed off, there were always those who sought to challenge the new status quo. The alien species inside the stellar compound were not known for their tolerance, and David knew it was only a matter of time before someone would try to test him. But even with the uneasy peace, David couldn't help but feel the subtle undertones of something deeper at play. As he moved through the prison, he was no longer the target of ridicule and mockery. Instead, the other prisoners watched him with a mixture of curiosity and respect, often giving him a wide berth. Even the Silens, those faceless overseers who usually remained distant, had begun to give him occasional glances of recognition. One day, as he made his way to the communal yard for a brief respite from the constant surveillance, David noticed something unusual: a group of Harlans waiting by the entrance. They were standing in a loose formation, but there was a clear leader, an older Harlan with silvery exoskeleton plating and a set of jagged mandibles that gleamed in the harsh artificial light. David hesitated, sensing the tension in the air. The Harlans weren't known for their diplomacy. Their insectoid nature made them unpredictable and aggressive, and their people were notorious for forming alliances only when it served them. But after what had happened with Zark, David understood that it wasn't just physical strength that kept him safe. It was the careful game of politics that came with survival in this prison. The leader of the Harlans stepped forward, his clicking mandibles signaling the start of a conversation. "You are the one who defeated the THRYSS," he said, his voice low and gravelly, but with a tone of respect. "You are not what we expected." David studied him carefully, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "I'm just a human trying to survive," he said cautiously. "And if you're thinking of starting trouble, you'll regret it." The Harlan leader seemed to appreciate the bluntness. He nodded. I am Karath, leader of the Harlans in this prison, and I am here to offer you a proposition. David's instincts flared with caution. He knew better than to take such offers at face value. In a place like this, even the smallest gesture of friendliness could be a trap. But Karatha's demeanor suggested something different, something that piqued David's curiosity. The Harlans were notorious for their cunning and brutal efficiency, and David understood that if they were offering an alliance, it meant they saw something in him worth aligning with. Go on, David said, taking a step back to give Karath space. You've earned the respect of the prisoners here, human, Karath continued. But that respect comes at a cost. You've made enemies, and some of them are far more dangerous than the THRYSS. The Zarthar, for example. They are watching you, David Gray. They will not forget what you did. David raised an eyebrow. The Zarthar were a telepathic race, highly intelligent and manipulative. They didn't need brute strength. To be a threat, they could invade minds, twist thoughts, and control emotions. David knew they'd been observing him since the confrontation with Zark, but he hadn't realized they had already started plotting against him. Why are you telling me this? David asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension. If the Zarthar are the threat, why don't you just deal with them yourself? Karath clicked his mandibles together, a sound that echoed in the silence between them. We Harlans do not trust the Zarthar. They are too secretive, too manipulative. But you have the strength to fight them directly, without fear. You are not bound by their games. And that is why I want you on our side. David considered the offer. He was no fool. Karath wasn't offering this alliance out of the goodness of his heart. He saw David as a tool to deal with the Zarthar, a dangerous species who could threaten the fragile balance of power in the prison. But the alternative was being left to fend for himself against a telepathic race that could tear him apart mentally before he even had a chance to raise his fists. And what do you want in return? David asked, already suspecting the answer. Karatha's eyes narrowed, his insectoid face betraying no emotion. Protection. The Zarthar will try to manipulate you, isolate you. They will exploit your humanity, your weaknesses. But if we stand together, if you join us, we can protect you from their reach, and we will ensure the THRYSS know their place. David weighed the options in his mind. It wasn't ideal. Forming an alliance with a ruthless insectoid species like the Harlans was not something he would have done under normal circumstances. But in the stellar compound, normal circumstances didn't exist. If he refused, he'd become a target for the Zarthar and everyone else who saw him as a threat. If he accepted, he would at least have a powerful ally in Karath, someone who could help him navigate the political web of the prison. David nodded, his decision made. All right, Karath. I'll join you. But know this. I'm not your puppet. I'm in this for me. And I'll make sure you remember that. Karatha's mandibles clicked in approval. You have a deal, human. But be warned. The Zarthar will not take this lightly. They have their eyes on you, and they will strike soon. Just then, the air around them seemed to shift, as if the prison itself was holding its breath. The Zarthar had arrived. They moved through the courtyard like shadows, their tall, lithe bodies graceful despite the heavy presence they commanded. Their telepathic influence rippled through the air, and David could feel the pressure in his mind as their mental presence swept over him. But this time, David wasn't alone. Karatha's Harlan stood at his side, a reminder that alliances could change the course of the battle. The Zarthar leader, Vathar, stepped forward, his long, narrow face twisted in a faint sneer. So, the human has chosen his allies, he said, his voice both mental and physical, creating an unnerving sense of being surrounded by his thoughts. How predictable. But understand this, David Gray. You cannot hide from us. You will never escape our reach. David's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. With Karath and his Harlans by his side, he knew that the game was far from over. The real struggle had only just begun. And in this brutal, unforgiving prison, alliances could make or break a life. You'll regret underestimating me, David said, meeting Vathar's cold, calculating gaze. But you won't have to wait long to find out. The moment David spoke, a strange stillness descended on the courtyard. The Zarthar had arrived in full force, their elongated forms casting eerie shadows as they encircled him, Korath, and the Harlans. Their telepathic presence was a constant hum in the back of David's mind, probing, searching for weaknesses. It was as though they were trying to unravel his thoughts, peel back his layers, and see if they could find a crack to exploit. But David had learned to block out such invasive sensations, pushing them away with mental discipline he had honed in his years as a soldier. Vathar, the Zarthar leader, stood at the forefront, his thin face betraying no emotion. His long, tendril-like fingers twitched slightly, an indication of his growing irritation. "You cannot protect him, Korath," Vathar said, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to vibrate inside David's skull. "The human will be ours, and you, Harlan, cannot save him." Korath, standing unflinching beside David, clicked his mandibles once more. "We've seen what you're capable of, Vathar. Your mind tricks won't work on him. David is strong, stronger than you think." David felt Korath's words like a challenge, but also as a reminder. The Harlans were playing a dangerous game here, and though he appreciated the alliance, he knew this wasn't a simple matter of protection. This was about control, about power, and about survival. "You underestimate him," David said, staring into the cold, unblinking eyes of the Zarthar. "You won't get inside my head." The words, though bold, were more for himself than anyone else. The Zarthar had a unique ability to manipulate thoughts, emotions, even perceptions. They could make you see things that weren't there, or twist your own mind into believing falsehoods. But David had faced mental battles before. He wasn't about to let them break him. Vathar's lips curled into a smile, though it was more of a predatory grin. "Oh, but you misunderstand, human. We don't need to get inside your mind. We simply need to isolate you, to make you question who you are, what you are. You think you're different from us, but you're not. You will bend to our will. In time." The words were chilling, not because of their truth, but because David could feel the weight of Vathar's telepathic pressure pressing down on him. His mind began to flicker, shadows of doubt creeping at the edges of his thoughts, trying to latch onto his fears. But David's mind was a steel trap, and he clenched his mental defenses with every ounce of his focus. Then, without warning, the pressure intensified. David's knees buckled slightly as the Zarthar leader's telepathic influence intensified, sending waves of cold fear and paranoia rushing through his consciousness. He could feel his past, memories of his family, his comrades, the war flash before him, twisted and warped. He was drowning in an ocean of confusion and uncertainty. They were right. He wasn't strong enough. He had always been weak, always had someone else protecting him. Why had he thought he could survive alone? What if he wasn't even human anymore? But then, something snapped within David. His training, his will to survive, kicked in. He forced the doubts away, pushing through the mental fog that the Zarthar had tried to weave around him. His pulse quickened, his breath sharp, but the mental fog began to clear. "Is that all you've got?" David muttered under his breath, his hands clenched into fists as he fought back the telepathic influence. His thoughts became sharper, clearer. Korath had been watching the exchange carefully. With a sudden movement, he lunged forward, drawing the attention of the Zarthar and breaking their focus on David. "Vathar, you've made a mistake," Korath growled, his mandibles clicking aggressively. "You think your tricks can break him. You're not dealing with just any prisoner. David Gray is something more, something you've never encountered before." David didn't know what had just happened, but he felt the pressure ease, if only for a moment. The Zarthar recoiled slightly, their leader's expression momentarily faltering as the telepathic grip loosened. David regained his footing, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just occurred. Vathar's smile faded, replaced by a deep scowl. "You may have resisted now, human, but this is not over. No one escapes the reach of the Zarthar." His voice turned cold and commanding. "We will make you suffer for this insolence. Your will may be strong, but it will be broken. We will make sure of it." Before David could respond, Vathar and the other Zarthar began to retreat, their cold gazes never leaving him. But as they turned their backs, Korath muttered something under his breath, and David felt the tension in the air shift. The Harlans were no longer just spectators. They were allies in this growing conflict, and they would not allow the Zarthar to threaten their newly formed power. "They'll be back," Korath said, his voice low. "The Zarthar always come back, but now they know they can't break you, and that will make them even more dangerous." David nodded, understanding the weight of Korath's words. The Zarthar weren't the kind of species to give up easily, especially after they had been so publicly challenged. They would regroup, reassess, and find new ways to try to bend David to their will. But Korath was right about one thing. David had shown them that he wasn't weak, and that alone would change the course of the battle. As Korath turned to lead his Harlans away, David felt the full weight of his situation crash down on him. The Zarthar were only one piece of the puzzle. There were still the THRYSS, still factions within the prison who saw him as a threat, and even more dangerous forces lurking in the shadows. His fight was far from over, but for the first time since his arrival at the prison, David felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He had Korath, he had the Harlans, and he had something the other prisoners didn't: a fire to survive, a will to not just endure, but to dominate. This was his battle, and he wasn't going to lose. The web was tightening around him, but David Gray had learned one thing above all else. When the web gets tight, you don't run, you break it. The next few days in the stellar compound were an uneasy calm. The Zarthar had pulled back, but their presence lingered in the air like a cloud of venom, ever watchful and calculating. The prison's atmosphere had shifted. No longer were the prisoners openly mocking David, but the tension was thick, palpable. The question of what would come next hung over the compound, unanswered. Who would be the next to make a move? David felt it more than anyone. The Zarthar's telepathic reach was still there, like a phantom whispering from the edges of his mind. Every step he took, every corner he turned, it felt as if he were being watched. But it wasn't just the Zarthar that worried him now. There was something deeper, something darker brewing in the shadows. Korath, despite his outwardly aggressive demeanor, had proven to be a valuable ally in the weeks that followed the confrontation. The Harlans had shown their loyalty by offering him a level of protection that was rare in the prison. But David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their alliance than Korath was letting on. Korath had been cagey, speaking in cryptic terms when David asked about the prison's deeper politics. There were rumors that the Harlans weren't just a small faction in the prison. They had eyes and ears everywhere. Their influence reached into the lower levels of the compound, and it was clear that Korath's position was far more complicated than it appeared. One evening, as the prison lights dimmed and the usual sounds of violence simmered in the distance, David found himself in the yard again, searching for some semblance of peace. The cold, metallic walls loomed around him, and he sighed, wondering if there would ever be a day when he wasn't stuck in this hellhole. He wasn't alone. As he sat on a bench, his eyes scanning the horizon, a figure approached. It was Sethera, one of the Zarthar who had been particularly quiet during the confrontation. She was an outlier in the Zarthar ranks, distant, almost detached from the power games her people liked to play. But there was something about her that made David uneasy. Sethera had watched him with curiosity from the moment he had stood against Zark. Unlike Vadhar, she didn't carry the same hostility. Instead, she seemed fascinated. Sethera stopped just a few feet away from him, her long fingers brushing the air as if measuring the distance. "You're still standing," she said softly, her voice laced with something David couldn't quite place. Amusement, perhaps, or pity. David stood, wary but not backing away. "What do you want, Sethera?" She regarded him with an almost calculating look, her violet eyes glinting with intelligence. "You've earned your place here, human. That much is clear." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "But you have no idea what you're up against." David tilted his head slightly, sensing that she wasn't here to threaten him. "I've had a few lessons in that already," he replied, trying to keep his tone even. "You Zarthar aren't as invincible as you think." Her lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "It's not just us, David. The Harlans, Korath, they're playing a dangerous game." She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if speaking to herself. "And so are you." David narrowed his eyes, his guard going up. "What do you mean? Speak plainly." Sethera studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her tone colder now. "Karatha's alliance with you isn't out of kindness, human. The Harlans are using you as much as you're using them. There are things going on in this prison that even you don't know about." David's heart skipped a beat. Karath was playing games, too. He had expected betrayal from the Zarthar. He had expected them to test him, break him. But the Harlans? He had thought they were a safe bet, a powerful ally in a prison full of predators. The thought that Karath had been using him, even manipulating him, sent a cold wave of doubt through David's veins. "What are you talking about?" David asked, his voice growing firmer. "I fought alongside Karath and his people. They've protected me." Sethera shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. "You've seen what happens when you rise above your station in this place. Zark was only the beginning. Karath may have saved you from the Zarthar, but he will not hesitate to throw you to the wolves when the time comes." David clenched his fists, his mind racing. Was Sethera trying to manipulate him? Was she trying to turn him against his allies? Or was there truth in her words? He couldn't tell, but the seeds of doubt were already planted. "And why should I trust you?" he asked, narrowing his gaze. "You're a Zarthar. You have your own agenda." Sethera's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was a bitter, knowing smile. "Because I'm offering you a choice, David. I'm offering you a chance to get out of this prison, out of this war. You can rise above all the factions here, but you'll need to stop relying on the Harlans. They're not your friends. Not in the way you think." David took a step back, his mind whirling. A way out. Was that even possible in a place like this? Was Sethera offering him an escape? Or was she just trying to play him against Karath? Before he could ask another question, the air shifted. A sharp clang echoed through the yard, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. A patrol of THRYSS guards appeared at the far end of the yard, their large, muscular forms outlined against the dim lights. Sethera's posture stiffened, her expression cold as she turned away from David. "This conversation is over," she said quietly, her voice returning to its usual detached tone. "Think carefully about your next move. You may not have much time left." And just like that, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the prison, leaving David standing there with more questions than answers. The doubt lingered like a bitter taste in his mouth. Was Sethera right? Was Karath truly manipulating him, using him as a pawn in a much larger game? David's instincts told him that the truth was never as simple as it appeared in the stellar compound. There was no such thing as real friendship here, just power plays, lies, and betrayal. And David had to be prepared for whatever came next, even if it meant trusting no one. But as he made his way back to his cell, he couldn't shake the thought that Sethera might have been telling the truth. Was it time to play his own hand? Or would he wait, hoping that the uneasy alliance with Karath would hold long enough for him to make his escape? Either way, one thing was certain. The game had changed. And David Gray was no longer just a pawn. He was a player. The days following his conversation with Sethera weighed heavily on David. He had spent countless hours alone in his cell, turning over her words in his mind. The Zarthar were always dangerous. That much was certain. But the thought that Karath, the Harlan leader, might be playing him all along left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had trusted Karath, perhaps more than anyone else in the prison. To consider that the insectoid leader might be manipulating him, just as the Zarthar had attempted, was a hard pill to swallow. David spent the next several days walking a fine line. The uneasy alliance with the Harlans remained in place, but his trust in Karath was now fractured. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of paranoia, as if everything was slipping from his grasp. Karath had protected him from the Zarthar's telepathic influence during their first confrontation, but was that merely a strategic move? Or had Karath been trying to use David as a tool to further his own hidden agenda? And then there was Sethera. Her warning echoed in his mind. Karath will not hesitate to throw you to the wolves when the time comes. The Zarthar leader had seemed genuine in offering David a way out of the prison. But was it just another attempt to manipulate him? In a place like the stellar compound, nothing was ever simple. David couldn't afford to make a mistake, but the deeper he looked, the more he realized that every path he considered seemed fraught with peril. The Zarthur weren't the only dangerous faction in the prison. Korath and the Harlans had their own power dynamics, and if David wasn't careful, he might find himself as the pawn in a much larger game. It was late one evening when everything began to unravel. David was sitting in the yard, watching the low-hanging lights above him flicker, casting long, angular shadows across the concrete floor. His mind was racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle of his situation. Every step felt like walking on a razor's edge. The Zarthur were still watching him. He could feel their cold, telepathic gaze from across the compound. But it wasn't just them. He knew that the HFYs were lurking, waiting for their moment to strike. That was when Korath found him. The Harlan leader stepped from the shadows, his insectoid figure looming like a giant among the smaller alien prisoners. His massive exoskeleton gleamed in the dim light, and his mandibles clicked with a rhythm that was both threatening and calculating. "David," Korath's voice rumbled, deep and gravelly. "We need to talk." David stood slowly, his gaze never leaving the Harlan leader. His body tensed, sensing that something was off. The air around them felt thick with unspoken tension. Something was about to happen. "What's going on, Korath?" David asked, keeping his tone guarded. "You've been acting strange lately." Korath's mandibles twitched. "There are things you don't understand, human," he said, his voice quiet but filled with weight. "Things I've kept from you." David's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" Korath stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The Zarthur have been making moves. They're not the only ones. The THRYSS are in on this, too. They've formed a coalition. We've been watching you closely, David. And now we need you to make a decision." David's heart began to race. The Zarthur, the THRYSS, and the Harlans, all vying for power in this prison. Korath's words were like a thunderclap in the storm that had been gathering. David had known the stakes were high, but hearing it all laid bare was a cold reality. "You want me to choose a side?" David asked, his voice edged with skepticism. He didn't know whether to feel angry, betrayed, or simply resigned to the madness of it all. Korath didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "It's more complicated than that. The factions are already dividing the prison into territories. You have the THRYSS in the south, the Zarthur controlling the mental network, and the Harlans consolidating resources. But it's all about control. There's a bigger game being played, David, and we need you to take a stand." David crossed his arms, narrowing his gaze. "And what do I get in return for taking a stand, Korath? You said it yourself, there's a coalition forming. Why would I join you?" Korath's eyes glinted in the low light. "Because, human, you're more valuable than you realize. We've been watching you, studying you. You're not like the others in this prison. You're special. You could tip the balance in our favor." David took a step back, his mind racing. Was Korath trying to recruit him into a larger power play? Did the Harlans really see him as some kind of weapon? Or was this another manipulation, like everything else in this hellhole? "I don't trust you, Korath," David said, his voice cold. "Not anymore." Korath's mandibles clicked in frustration, but his expression softened. "I know you don't trust me, human. But that's not important right now. What matters is that we need to act before it's too late. The Zarthur are already moving their pieces, and if we don't act fast, they will have control over everything, this prison, and everyone in it." David stood there, frozen in place, weighing his options. Everything was spinning out of control. The Zarthur wanted him, the THRYSS wanted him, and now Korath was trying to pull him into the Harlan's fold. He had always relied on his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him to trust no one. But trusting no one also meant that he couldn't escape the prison's intricate web of power. He had no choice but to choose a side, or at least, that's what everyone seemed to think. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the yard, followed by a series of guttural roars. David spun around, instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. A group of THRYSS prisoners were rushing toward them, weapons drawn and eyes filled with fury. "Get down!" Korath barked, grabbing David's arm and pulling him behind a nearby pillar, just as the first THRYSS reached the edge of the yard. The air crackled with tension as the two factions, Harlans and THRYSS, clashed in a brutal skirmish, the sounds of combat reverberating across the prison. David's mind raced. This was what Karath had been warning him about. The factions were already at war, and the balance of power was tipping. The Zarthar, the Harlans, the THRYSS, they were all fighting for control of the stellar compound, and David was stuck in the middle. As the chaos unfolded around him, David realized something. He couldn't afford to sit on the sidelines any longer. He needed to make a choice, and fast. But who could he trust in this treacherous game? Karath was right about one thing. The web of deceit was closing in fast, and David Gray was about to discover just how deep the prison's politics ran. The battle in the yard intensified, the sound of clashing alien weapons and enraged shouts filling the air. David crouched behind the pillar with Karath, his breath sharp in his chest, his heart pounding. The Harlans and THRYSS were locked in brutal combat, a battle for dominance that had been brewing beneath the surface of the stellar compound for weeks. David's mind raced, trying to process everything he had learned, everything that had led up to this point. His choices were narrowing, and the walls of this prison were closing in on him. Karath glanced over at him, his mandibles clicking in irritation. The THRYSS are more organized than we expected, the Harlan leader growled, his voice low. But it doesn't matter. We have the advantage here. They won't last long. David didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the chaos of the battle and the revelations Karath had just dropped on him. He had been an unwilling pawn in this game from the moment he had arrived in the stellar compound. Now, as the factions fought around him, the reality was clear. If he didn't make a move soon, he would be swallowed by the war for control. Sethera had warned him. Karath might be using him just as much as the Zarthar. But was Sethera any different? Could he trust the Zarthar, the THRYSS, or any of them? He needed to act. But how? And who could he trust? A sudden explosion rocked the yard, sending a shower of debris flying into the air. David instinctively ducked lower, pulling Karath behind the pillar with him. A flash of light illuminated the chaos as weapons discharged, and the THRYSS pressed forward, determined to carve a bloody path through the Harlans. Karatha's eyes glinted with something close to excitement. This is what we've been waiting for, David. The power shift is happening now, and we have to be part of it. David, his mind still a whirlpool of doubt and tension, shook his head. I'm not sure I want any part of this anymore, Karath. Karatha's expression hardened, but his tone was measured. You don't have a choice, human. The moment you stepped into this prison, you became a player. Everyone here is fighting for their survival, and no one survives alone. The Zarthar will eventually come for you. The THRYSS will take their piece of the pie, and the Harlans. He paused, his mandibles clicking with thought. We'll make sure you're not a pawn. But you have to choose where you stand. If you stand with us, we fight together. If you stand alone, the consequences will be dire. David clenched his fists. Karatha's words stung with truth. The prison wasn't just a cage. It was a battleground. A battleground where the strong dictated who lived and who died. He couldn't afford to be naive anymore. Every faction here had its own agenda, its own plan for dominance. The Zarthar wanted him for their mental manipulation. The THRYSS were ruthless in their quest for power, and the Harlans, led by Karath, had their own designs. But David had learned a hard lesson. Trusting too easily would get him killed. Karath, I don't know if I can trust you, David muttered, his eyes scanning the battleground. The fighting had escalated, and there was no clear victor yet. The THRYSS and the Harlans were evenly matched, but there was a growing sense of instability in the air. Karatha's gaze was unwavering, the tension between them thickening. You don't have to trust me. You just have to survive. And to do that, you need allies. If you think you can do this alone, you're wrong. I know the Harlans. We are a force to be reckoned with. And I will keep my word. But I can't protect you if you don't commit. David's stomach twisted. He didn't know if he could trust Karath, or if his instincts were lying to him. But as he watched the chaos unfold before him, something inside him clicked. He could either cower in fear, play their game, and wait for someone else to make the move, or he could take control and decide for himself. And if he was going to fight, he wasn't going to play second fiddle to anyone. David stood up suddenly, feeling the surge of energy in his veins, the pull of action. "Then I choose," he said, his voice sharp and clear, louder than the sounds of combat around him. Korath looked at him, his mandibles slightly parted in surprise. "What?" David didn't hesitate. He moved out from behind the pillar and into the fray, the adrenaline coursing through his blood. "I'm not going to sit back and let others decide my fate anymore. I'll make my own way. I'll make my own choices." He ran toward the battle, his heart pounding, his thoughts aligning. Korath had spoken the truth. The time for waiting was over. The Harlans, the Zarthar, and the THRYSS, they were all just pieces on a chessboard, fighting for control. But David wasn't about to let himself be just a pawn. David found himself in the middle of the battle, a war zone where weapons fired and combatants clashed with wild abandon. Harlans and THRYSS locked in combat, their alien forms and weapons flashing through the haze. David didn't have a weapon on him. He had no armor, no tools, but he had one thing: his sheer will to survive. He spotted a THRYSS soldier advancing on Korath, weapon raised, intent on delivering a lethal blow. Without thinking, David sprinted forward, using the momentum of his run to shoulder the THRYSS soldier aside. The soldier staggered, and David took advantage of the opening, throwing a well-placed punch to the side of his enemy's head. The THRYSS fell to the ground, stunned but not out. David scrambled for a nearby weapon, grabbing a crude blade dropped by a fallen fighter, and in one swift motion, dispatched the THRYSS soldier. His heart raced, not just from the physical exertion, but from the realization he had just stepped into the fight, actively choosing his path. Korath approached, his eyes scanning the battlefield, his mandibles clicking approvingly. "You've got potential, David. But remember, this is just the beginning. The real test is yet to come." David turned to face him, his expression fierce. "I'll be ready." The battle raged around them, but for the first time since arriving at the prison, David felt a surge of clarity. He wasn't fighting for Korath or the THRYSS or the Zarthar. He was fighting for himself, for survival, for freedom. The factions would keep battling for control, but David had made his choice. He wasn't going to let anyone control him. He would rise, and he would fight, not just to survive, but to take everything he deserved. And as the final waves of battle crashed against the pillars of the prison, David Gray realized one crucial truth. In a place like this, the only way to win was to outlast everyone else. The stellar compound might be a prison, but it was about to meet its match. Because David was no longer just a prisoner. He was a force. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.